You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by architect Vishaan Chakrabarti to talk about his book, The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature, Culture, and Joy. We discuss the goldilocks density, defining urbanity, and the ennui of young architects. Stay with us. This week's podcast, as always, is sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for sponsoring this show and our Monday shows. We really appreciate all of you for keeping this thing going. To join this merry band of supporters, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you some of our transportation scarves. And speaking of scarves, it's fall again. Get your bus and bike scarves at the newly revamped theoverheadwire.com. There you can find scarves, sign up for the newsletter, get links to all of our various merch, including Bookshop and TeePublic, Cars or Cholesterol, etc. We've also got an awesome new search function for subscribers on the site, so you can access all of our 100,000 item news link archive. That's all of it. You can access all of it through the search functions that we've created for the site. But as we've done the last several weeks, we continue to celebrate 500 episodes. This is the last part of that party. But again, I want to thank everybody who recorded something or wrote in, folks who shared something on social media or wrote us a private note as well. Much appreciation for you all. And of course, the listeners, we wouldn't be here without you. So thanks very much. And here's to 500 more. We've got a couple of letters and then we'll get to this awesome episode with Vishaan Chakrabarti. Okay, so I got a couple of long ones this week to end it up, and some of my favorite folks on here. So Ezra Pincus Roth, I remember in 2013 when Jeff and I were working at Reconnecting America, and Jeff low-key dropped in some news about a new podcast via the Streets Blog Network. The staff at RA were all obviously enthused to see our colleague embarked on this new project. The name Talking Headways and that familiar sentimental theme music sold us for sure, if I recall the email threads of yesteryear. Since then, I've found the most fulfillment catching up on multiple Talking Headways episodes back to back when taking myself on long trips to communities across the country for consulting work. You know, sometimes we get so deep in our own respective projects, interests, and worlds that we forget to take a step back, keep an open mind, and be reminded and inspired by the amount of work that's out there to improve our overall quality of life. Jeff's interview subjects have their highs and lows, of course, but I know he's always seeking out new topics that interest him and keeping an eye on what is most constructive. And Jeff's genuine self and good faith constructive interviewing have been a reliable presence in this age of information overload. It's been a pleasure to watch your multimedia empire grow. Congrats on 500 episodes and wishing you the best. Well, thanks, Ezra. It's been great to to have you listening and give me feedback, and I really appreciate our discussions as well that we've had over the years. And Ezra is doing some great work over at Nelson Nygaard, and I really appreciate it for that. And we look forward to seeing more great projects coming out of his shop. So thanks, Ezra. I appreciate that. Jillian Harris. Jillian is a longtime listener, an early supporter on Patreon. Jeff, we're at 500. Oh my gosh, where did the time go? There's a lot I could say about the impact of these 500 episodes, but I'll keep it short. Being a guest on your podcast and sharing the trials and tribulations of transportation planning in San Antonio has always been a highlight of my career. I'm forever grateful for the vote of confidence you gave me as I was starting out as a baby planner in the industry, incredibly enthusiastic about making positive change in my community, but also ridiculously overwhelmed. And after leaving San Antonio and moving to Wyoming, Talking Headways was a familiar friend on my I-25 drives between Cheyenne and Colorado Springs, Denver, Fort Collins to visit family or run errands, because Cheyenne doesn't have a Trader Joe's. Since moving to Okinawa, Talking Headways has accompanied on my 15-minute, 40-kilometer-per-hour work commutes and weekend drives to the other parts of the island. Being reminded of the realities of American roads against the backdrop of island life has been oddly comforting, but more so because it reminds me of how grateful I am to live in a place where walking and biking is normal, cars do not own the road, and traffic crashes are hardly a thing. Talking Headways and the Overhead Wire have been a personal and professional lifeline since moving overseas in early 2022. While I don't work in transportation right now, I hope to pick up somewhat where I left off whenever I return to the States. Staying connected with all things transportation and transportation adjacent was made possible by you and your work. Forever and always grateful. To the next 500 episodes, Jillian. Oh, thanks, Jillian. That's awesome. It was great to chat with you about San Antonio, and always great to hear about the work that you've been doing. And, good luck in Okinawa. That sounds really awesome to be over there. And I'm sure it's great. And it sounds like island life is fun. And make sure you get up on the Shinkansen and head over to some of the other parts of Japan that are really amazing. I've heard great things. And also, if I have to make a recommendation, definitely check out the jet lag episode on YouTube, the game that they play where they're going around Japan. It's amazing. I'm so jealous of people that get to live there and get that access to transportation like they have. So Jillian, thanks again. I appreciate it. And Ryan Wozniak, one of our favorites as well. Jeff Wood is a lifelong learner, and he brings us all on his inquisitive journey. I can't begin to quantify the impact all the ideas Jeff has delivered to my ear, and some have deeply influenced my passions and value for the work of planning and our methodology. Ryan, that's great. It was great to have you on the Monday show recently. Also, it was great to see you in Phoenix for last year's MPAC conference, and the next conference is up here in Philadelphia, and I hope to see you there as well. But if we don't, I'll make sure to make it back to Phoenix at some point to see you. And keep up the great work. And thanks so much for the really kind note. You've always left great notes on LinkedIn and other spots, so I appreciate that. And finally, David Meyer of Streets Vlog, huge congrats and shout out to the Overhead Wire. On the eve of his 500th podcast episode, I've learned a lot from Jeff's work, ! And David is a fellow Star Wars fan. We got to get David on for one of those episodes where we talk about Star Wars, but doing great work at Streets Blog, and thanks for posting the podcast. I mean, I mentioned Tanya that, if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't be started. And I will say, if it wasn't for Gersh and David now, we wouldn't get these podcasts posted up on Streets Blog USA. So thank you all very much. And thanks to everybody at Streets Blog, actually, because, like I've mentioned when we were talking with Tanya, I mean, they've just been really supportive of our work. I mean, we took over the podcast from the Tanya and Jeff show, back around episode 50 or so. And so it's been, 450 episodes since then that we've been doing, and they've just let us kind of go and do the things that we want to do, which is like the best way to go, just to, be free and learn the things we want to learn. And hopefully you all enjoy it too. So in any event, that's enough for 500 episode celebrations. Maybe we'll be back at 750 or 1,000 or something along those lines, but we'll keep on chugging. We've got at least 6 weeks of episodes now, plus what's ever going to happen at Impact. So I'm looking forward to another set of episodes towards the end of the year, and then looking forward to the new year. We got some stuff that we're working on, and stuff that I've been working on forever, that I've been telling you guys about forever, that I still haven't done yet, but we'll get there. So in any event, here's Vishaan Chakrabarti. Vishaan Chakrabarti, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was born in India, came to this country with my parents when I was 2 years old. They came here with $32 and 2 kids, and grew up in suburban Boston and traveled a great deal with my parents. My dad was a scientist. My mother was a classical singer. And so we kind of had traveled on a shoestring budget to cities around the world. I think my love of cities come from those early trips.
Where'd you go?
Gosh, we went to the Soviet Union before the wall fell, because my father had a lecture in Helsinki, and we took the overnight train to what was then Leningrad. Soviet troops boarded the train at 2 a.m, go through our bags, German Shepherds, Kalashnikovs. It was great.
Whoa.
Like a Bond movie. We went to all sorts of amazing places. And again, they had so little money, but like somehow my father would splice and dice an honorarium and figure it out. And then studied engineering and art history and fine art in college. And that ultimately led, after some work in New York, to urban planning. And then I kind of went to architecture kicking and screaming. I was as someone who had studied planning and was really steeped in policy issues and urbanism, I was a little skeptical about the relevance of architecture to the world. And then within 2 weeks, I got sucked into studio and I never looked back. So, a lot of my professional life was about weaving. I mean, what's interesting about, you went to Austin, in so many schools, architecture and urban planning are co-located. And yet the two really don't talk to each other, for all the talk of interdisciplinary this and that. I am really a kind of manifestation of both disciplines. And, the most recent book is this attempt to weave those. And what I find, we live in such a specialist kind of nation that there's always this desire to say, oh, well, if he's talking about this, he's not that. If he's talking about that, he's not this. And I really try to, keep myself on that line because I think it's the scale shift that is so intellectually interesting. And so anyway, that's how I got to here.
I find myself getting a little bit of imposter syndrome when I try to like talk about things that are outside of the realm of what people believe I know or understand. And we try to cover a lot of stuff on the newsletter: environment, cities, housing, planning, transportation, all those things. But I also feel like sometimes I should stay in my lane to a certain extent, right? And I feel like that's wrong because we know so much about our experiences with the things that we do and the people that we talk to and the friends that we have. So
My wife and I yesterday were talking about refinancing a mortgage, and we're like, "Well, do you think the bank has baked in like a rate change in September?" Like the two of us are central bankers, right? People do that all the time. You think about the political world we're in. We're just like we get immersed in all this information that's outside of our disciplines. And like to me, the interesting thing is, can you weave it in, right? And so, this book, it's a lot of disparate topics in there. There's neoliberal economics and there's cars and there's a lot of different things. And I think for some people it probably will be fairly discordant, but I think that's our jobs today. Like you can't climate change, political division, like these things are so complicated and like I don't think you can really tackle them without some interdisciplinary breadth while maintaining your disciplinary depth. That makes sense.
yeah, oh, totally. They're so connected, right? They're so connected because all these things, even in their silo, there's a hook to get you into that other section. Like, you talk about cars and stuff like that in the book, and we'll get to that in a second. But I just feel like that connectivity is clear in your book, but also I feel like that's an important point to make because we shouldn't be stuck in the transportation space only or the urbanism space only or the housing space only because all these things are interconnected, or even healthcare for that matter. It
Yeah.
just seems like all these things are connected. And when we keep them disconnected, it hurts us all.
It's funny. My first job out of college was as a transportation planner at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey because my weird background in art history and engineering. I don't know how I ended up being a transportation planner because I had done some interning in it and I loved it. And so I think transportation has always like just been near and dear to my heart because it's a design issue and it's a social justice issue and it's an economic issue and it's all those things. And so yeah, I don't find the disaggregation of this stuff very interesting.
Yeah. Well, you have varied experience from the New York City Planning Department. You're the dean of the UC Berkeley College of Environmental Design. You're an architect with your firm now, POW. How does all that mix of experiences and work shape you? Not just your education originally, but just like all the experiences you had after that.
Well, so POW is the firm is very much trying to synthesize, even though it's an architecture firm, it's a hardcore architecture firm. Most of what we do is architecture. We actually don't do that much urban planning, but we practice a lot of urbanism within the architecture that we do, and we can talk about what that means. But yeah, I mean, at some point, starting your own firm is a wonderfully freeing thing, especially as a person of color in America. Like you can get out from underneath a lot of stuff, but also it just allows you to not have to listen to the people who say, stay in your lane over here, stay in your lane. You create your own lane. And I think what's wonderful about the country is that like the people who are interested in finding you in the lane that you've created are great. And they will hire you to do things and you do interesting things together. I was an urban planner and then I was an architect and I was planning to just stay a hardcore architect. I was in a big firm. I was fairly happy. Then 9/11 happened. And 9/11 kind of put me on a 10-year detour into a bunch of other things. Yes, I worked for Mayor Bloomberg right after 9/11 as the director of planning for Manhattan, and then did this joint venture for a train station, and then worked in academia, wrote my first book, went back to architecture. So, I always tell young people that they should, it's one thing to switch jobs every 6 months. I'm not recommending that, but I think it's important to have a lot of different professional experiences, especially when you're young. And architecture can be the worst in terms of like it's like an extremely monastic practice, right? Like you're supposed to go and you pledge celibacy and you go do this thing for years and then you get licensed and then like you focus on how a piece of glass meets a piece of metal and like how a piece of glass meets a piece of metal is incredibly important, right? But it's not, you got to look up from your desk And we were always taught from the first day in design school that all acts of architecture are political. So if that's true, what's the political environment in which you practice? And so Pow very much takes all those disparate experiences. And I do this with a team of people who have similarly nonlinear backgrounds, right? So I call them a bunch of Swiss Army knives who are constantly curious. So if we work with a transportation planner or a structural engineer, we are absolutely spellbound by what they have to say about a site because it's all sauce for the goose. It all helps to make the kind of rich urban tapestry you're trying to build. And so it is a real joy to be able to do that. Running an architecture firm sucks, but like, right, like, but it is a real joy to kind of be able to create that lane for yourself and run down it.
I think running the business of anything sucks. Doing the work is fun, but running the business is never the most joyful for sure.
It's terrifying. Yeah.
Well, so you mentioned you wrote another book, A Country of Cities, a manifesto for urban America back in 2013, I think it was. Where did that book take you in terms of what you were thinking of at the time and, as it led into the book that we're going to talk about in a second, The Architecture of Urbanity?
Well, first of all, I love writing, and I've always loved writing, and I used to think of it as an avocation, and increasingly think of it as a vocation. And it's like very commonplace for architects to say do other visual things, paint, sculpt, whatever. Writing is a much more unusual thing. In fact, architects are very, very good at butchering words. But I have this great, great respect for language, and so I had started writing a blog for the Architectural League in a place called Urban Omnibus, called The Country of Cities, and it was like a 10-part thing. And after the 10 parts were done, several people said to me, "This is no longer a blog; it's a book." It was all this advocacy for density in cities, and it's interesting to me. Like when I studied city planning before I studied architecture, it was the early '90s. Cities were not a hot topic. If you think back, cities had gone through a lot of malaise, and people were talking about suburban cities, and they were talking, there's early talk of the internet, and like there's always been this idea that people could work from a mountaintop, and it's funny, by the time I got to writing this first book, a series of books had come out. I think Ed Glazer's Triumph of the City was near the same time, and some other books that came out, and like there was this recognition that the world was urbanizing, and so suddenly you couldn't swing a cat without hitting someone who was talking about or writing about cities, which is great. I think it's fantastic. Like more the merrier. But that book, as much as I enjoyed writing it and working, like that was not an architectural book, I would say, for the most part. It was really much more a kind of policy book. A lot of graphics in it that were infographics, really. Something I'm very proud of is we did a tremendous amount of fact checking with that book, my editor and I, and like I had research assistants, and as much there are people who hate the book politically because it's arguing for density, and I didn't realize I was running into a culture war
Uh-huh.
when I was arguing for density. But no one's really assailed any of the facts in that book, which I'm really proud of. But the genesis of this book is really about the fact that the first book didn't answer a set of questions that brought me back actually to architecture, in the sense that the first book, A Country of Cities, was a strong piece of advocacy for transit oriented density in this country, and kind of less focused on the New Yorks and San Franciscos and more, Rust Belt cities and cities where density could easily take place because like they had been so carved out by urban renewal. And as I toured the country, the response I got from people who were interested was like, okay, Vishaan, I get the economic and environmental argument for transit oriented density. There's only one problem. All these new places that people are building are soul crushing crap, right? It's like they all look the same. If they're denser, they're these blue glass places. If they're less dense, it's like these ticky tacky places. The same Starbucks on the bottom. None of them channel the history or narratives of our local communities. To me, those early questions in some form were the kind of genesis of what we today call NIMBYism, especially in progressive communities. And I'm not saying all NIMBYism is about architecture. There's a bunch of people who are going to be anti-density no matter what. But what I really started to understand was that the means by which you build a place, not just the design, but the process, community engagement. And then in terms of design, how you can channel the local to build this kind of global idea, right? Which is we build cities a certain way around mass transit and so forth at different density scales. And we have a bunch of global metrics that we use, units per acre, FAR, other things that are very technocratic. But that's like a couple of surgeons talking to their patients about, scalpel techniques. It doesn't, you got to meet people where they are and talk to people about like, what will this mean to build this thing in their community? So the second book is really in some ways a retort to the first book. This isn't some technocratic exercise. It's about how you think about people building their neighborhoods and their worlds.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And it gets me to the next idea, which is this idea of urbanity, right? Thinking about that word in a way that separates the discussions between whether rural is better or urban is better, and your framing and repositioning of the word itself. The quote that I took out of the book specifically is, "Today we build metropolis, not urbanity."
Correct. And then what I wanted to do is separate the idea of urbanity and urban from size. If you just like ask a random person on the street and you say, what do these words mean to you, urbanity, urban, or even if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll usually get some version of two things sometimes amalgamated. One is that it's about snobbery. There's something like cosmopolitan in a bad way about the elite. The second is that you're talking about really like big mega cities. And again, sometimes those two things get conflated. I wanted to really disassemble that because I think it's a super important word in large measure because if you look at human history as a species, and the pandemic has kind of borne this out, we have organized in communal environments since antiquity. And the book has this big timeline that tries to explain this that across the world, and it wasn't just for commerce, it wasn't just for barter. In fact, most of the cities that we think of today that were built in antiquity, ancient Beijing, ancient cities across Mesoamerica, they were largely built for spiritual reasons, power, cultural reasons, things that extend well beyond barter, right? And so, what you start to understand is that as a species, and with the majority of us as bipeds, we interact in physical space. And that's something that we actually have chosen as a species to do. So, post pandemic, people didn't go run and move and work to a mountaintop. We've seen people move out of big, expensive cities. We've seen those people move into less expensive urban environments. So, right now, Kansas City and Nashville and Austin and San Antonio, all these places are boom towns because people want some form of an urban life, right? But not necessarily in cities they can't afford. And so urbanity is defined in the book as both a spatial and cultural condition where people basically of different cultures and classes collide in space. Like that's basically the definition. And the idea is that can happen in a small rural town or it can happen in a big city. And there are big cities that is a metropolis, but is not very urban. And so just because it's fun, I like to take Copenhagen to task because as I'm sure
I
you're
saw
aware,
that.
Copenhagen has been this like vaunted paradise of planners for like as long as not as long as I can remember, the last 10 years or so. And it's like, everyone bikes to get their kale and all of that. And I go to Copenhagen, it's a lovely city. But you talk to people there and you're like, where are all the immigrants? I literally had a senior city official, we're riding the metro, and I asked this question. And he literally looked at me and he said, oh, they're very happy. They live in a neighborhood over there. And like without any sense of irony. And I'm like, this place isn't urban, not by my definition. Because to me, it requires the grit of what I call in the book positive social friction. The idea that people who look different, pray different, and maybe most importantly, think differently from one another collide in space. So I use the example of Tokyo, which does not have a lot of foreign born people in it. But Tokyo is a city of like subcultures, of like crazy subcultures. And they all kind of interact and have this friction in space. And to me, this is fundamental to what makes a city feel alive and serendipitous and special. Like it always cracks me up when you see these lists of 10 most livable cities, and it's like Stuttgart. And you're like, really? how come 8 million people live in New York and 19 million people live in Mumbai? I mean, there's a lot of wealthy people in these big, quote, unlivable cities around the world that could live anywhere, but don't move to Stuttgart. I mean, no offense to Stuttgart, but like my point is just there seems to be this weird idea that in order for a place to be livable, you've got to crank the urbanity dial down. And what the book is trying to advocate is that, like, no, actually, what we need in our society today, especially given the divisions that social media has wrought, is face to face contact of difference. Like, to me, what beguiles me about cities is the idea of difference, that we see people who, again, maybe look different or pray differently, but also just like they dress differently. They have some fundamentally different attitude about how you exist in the world that makes you think and makes your mind grow and that challenge your assumptions. And so to me, those the rich complexities of culture, like, I don't think we talk about that in this space of let's have 30 units an acre and make sure that the bus rapid transit can get there. Like, all that's important, but to what end, right? And like, it's not just some carbon emissions per capita end. Like, that's important, but to me, that's almost a kind of byproduct of the cultural condition that people are seeking. And it's funny, I really struggled with the subtitle of this book, and it's Designing for Nature, Culture, and Joy. And so that was decided, I don't know, 6, 8 months ago. And then suddenly, like, the book comes out in this environment where everyone's been coconut pilled. And
Everybody's talking about
and
joy.
yeah, and everyone's talking about joy. And like, this is a very good thing for book sales, hopefully. But like, the larger point is that I think we're just at this moment, we're coming out of the pandemic, coming out of the murder of George Floyd, coming out of really tough things that our society's gone through. And no one is trying to downplay their seriousness. But if you don't have joy in your daily life, don't have some sense that your life is going to be experientially better, then the empirical stuff means less and less, right? And so this is why the design of experience, at least for me, is critically important. And then the last thing I'd say is we are starting to see data on that point. Like, the book mentions this extraordinary book called The Good Life. It's the longest study of human happiness that's ever been done. It's been done at Harvard. It's a longitudinal study. It's happened for generations. And it comes out with this conclusion. I mean, I'm vastly oversimplifying, but that basically, if you control for a bunch of variables like smoking and things like that, that both happiness and longevity are associated with strong social connections. And so my question then becomes, how do we design a built environment that is conducive? And I use that word very specifically because sometimes, like, the right will glom onto this stuff as some weird globalist plot to control how people live. So I use conducive to how people live and can make healthy connections. They choose to or not, that's up to them. But can we create platforms? And so to me, that always starts with the street. The street to me is the most basic building block of the entire human endeavor. And so, the problem is we think about streets as something built for cars. We have sidewalks that date back millennia in human history and in urban form. And so, again, it's that first place where people make contact eyeball to eyeball and experience serendipity and difference. And that then extends to plazas and parks and the doorways of buildings and public space inside of buildings. But like, to me, it always kind of starts with the street. And so that's kind of where the book starts too.
You also talk about the creation of kind of banal buildings worldwide, and I think that that connects to this as well. And you talk about this too in the book. How should architects and urban professions change in the 21st century to address the things that you just brought up in regards to urbanity and the mixing of people if they choose to do so?
Well, again, this transit-oriented density thing, Kamala Harris stood up about a week ago and said we need to build 3 million new homes in the United States. I think Senator Warren has been doing extraordinary work around housing. There is a worldwide housing crisis. My firm did an op-ed in the New York Times in December about how to house a million more New Yorkers while maintaining the character of New York City. And the response we got was absolutely global. Almost every major city in the world has a housing crisis, and everyone's trying to figure it out. And part of the puzzle goes back to this thing I said before, that most existing communities feel like the new stuff is awful. And some of them weaponize that because they're trying to just not get any more new neighbors in their neighborhood. Shame on them. But there are people who have a legitimate point. Like a lot of stuff is awful. In fact, most of it's awful. And the book tries to disassemble why that is. Yeah, some of it's the boogeyman of developers. And a lot of developers need to be more ambitious than they are. A lot of it's the way we mass produce building materials now globally. A lot of it's international building code, because international building code has made, like, if you think about like our most beloved urban environments that are dense, Paris and Barcelona are really, really dense. Central Shanghai, the old hutongs of Beijing, really charming places. Every single one of them is illegal by today's codes. And for reasons that are really good reasons, wheelchair access, fire retardants, like all of these things that one by one was death by a thousand cuts to the kind of density that people actually think of as a positive thing. And so we can't just rewind the tape. It's not about being nostalgic, but we have to understand where we've been to go forward. And so in the book, I talk about, well, there are new technologies for wheelchairs. There are new technologies for putting out fire in buildings. We don't need to design our entire built environment for 7 billion, what will be by the end of the century, 10 billion people around a couple of bad pieces of technology that could be much better. So, like the wheelchair, we've had wheelchairs that could climb stairs for years. They're expensive, but right now, architects, developers, builders, and like all of our clients, universities, etc., we're literally spending trillions of dollars. Buildings are much bigger as a consequence of having to accommodate this invention that needs an upgrade for every single person who needs a wheelchair. And I'm very sensitive to this. Both my parents passed away. They're both in wheelchairs at the end of their life. I'm 1,000% for wheelchair access, and I don't want it. So I don't want it misconstrued. But if you could give people better wheelchairs, you could design better environments. Same thing with fire trucks. Like if you walk down the average American suburban subdivision, and you see a sea of pavement that's now a heat island. Like people in Phoenix are tripping and getting hospitalized because of burns because they're falling on asphalt that has gotten so hot from the sun. Well, why is there so much asphalt? Because of the turning radius of a ladder truck. And I like go to these planning meetings and I like rip what little hair I have out, because in Europe you just use smaller fire trucks. Like it's like, it is so the tail wagging the dog. And today we have drone technology, we have all these other ways of dealing with these things. And so we can't go back to scratch, but at least as we build new things, as we think about retrofitting things, and we think about the places that people really cherish, and they're always tight-knit spaces, pedestrian oriented. And as an architect who really believes in cities, I spend most of my day wrestling down parking garages and fire lanes, all of these things that are super practical. And I get that people have their needs in like a big sprawling country, but creating these places of urbanity, creating places where community can get together, it's almost always this crazy fight with 20th century bad technology.
There's this interesting section in the book, too, about the rise and damage of neoliberalism, especially from a public investment perspective. And I think that kind of ties into this discussion about fire trucks and, public good and those types of things. I'm wondering how the system that kind of rose in the 80s is really impacting us today, because it seems like it's done a lot of damage to our ability to have government do things that we want them to do and make them, create places that spark joy, for lack of a better phrase.
Right. So the neoliberal project, this basic idea that you need to starve the beast of government, what the book tries to go through is the history of where that comes from and how much it's undergirded by race. And what I mean by that is prior to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society stuff and prior to the civil rights movement, there isn't a lot of angst in this country about federal expenditure of tax dollars, right? So 1956, Federal Highway and Defense Act. We spent a massive amount of money building highways. We built, Teddy Roosevelt built national parks. No one sat there and said, oh, this is crazy profligate spending. But when you suddenly say, well, the spending has to go, we're going to redefine public to make sure we include all of the public. I mean, we're in a country where African American women did not get full rights to vote nationwide until 1965, the year of my birth. And so the definition of public needed to expand to include everybody. As soon as that happened, all of a sudden, government expenditure went from, oh, sure, we're going to give people the GI Bill and mortgage interest deductions and like all of that's absolutely fine, to, oh my God, welfare queens and public housing are sucking away all of our tax dollars. None of it was ever true, especially as a percentage basis. Like, take the mortgage interest deduction, biggest housing expenditure the United States makes. It is a boondoggle of a subsidy. Why it was ever made so that it could help people above the average price of an American home, right? Like, so you're eligible if you're a married couple, I think, to $1.1 million. The average home in the United States is, I believe, under $300,000. Maybe it's now a little higher because of inflation and all that. Why was this ever a good idea? Well, again, because it wasn't really neoliberalism. It wasn't really starving the beast. It was saying we're spending too much on a certain kind of person. And that was usually about cities and urbanity. Like, the book also goes through what really undergirded the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe and public housing, and these crazy, crazy recriminations about, well, it was, the federal government shouldn't be in this because developers do it more efficiently, or like, these things simply weren't true. But we gutted these systems, and so to me, like, I don't think we focus enough on what the again in MAGA is about. Like, what's the again about? It's not just like culture wars about going back to a time when like Black people and women knew their place. It is that, but it's more than that. It is about a moment pre Great Society where we had people on the dole, but it was the kind of people that we thought should be on the dole because they, quote, deserve it. They work hard, they deserve it. And so, the suburbs are a creation of this mentality. And so it's been very, very damaging, all of that. I think we are now finally coming out of that. We're doing some work for the FAA and just getting closer to some of the stuff that Pete Buttigieg has been talking about undoing some of the damage that was done with federal renewal and highways. Just this recognition that a lot of bad things happened in our cities. And now we have the reverse problem, which is communities, particularly communities of color, that held our cities together through the bad times, through the 70s and the 80s, through all this disinvestment, through white flight, through highways, all that stuff. Now, as cities, as like Seinfeld and Friends and like all those, like, people rediscover cities, then all this gentrification takes place. And now, like in New York City today, we're losing historically Black populations because they can't afford to live there anymore, even though they were the people who held the place together through the worst of times. And so I think that history is really important to know, because it's hard to be a lover of cities and a builder of cities without knowing, the context in which you're stepping. And so the book tries to go through that in some detail, but with a really specific lens around architecture and urban planning.
I do like the fact that we're starting to change the discussion around that, specifically with the investments that we're trying to make. And now those investments aren't perfect. The infrastructure bill is not perfect. The Inflation Reduction Act is not perfect, but they do provide money and the basis for starting to talk about this stuff differently, right?
Oh, they're massive accomplishments. So the first book, which was out in 2013, a lot of it was written in 2009, 2010 period. And like I was an early Obama adapter, the fact that my beautiful brown children grew up with a dark-skinned president was enormously important for me and my family. I'm still amazed by that man. You will remember his 2009 stimulus package because the economy had been so tanked by the Bush administration. There was all this stuff about like high-speed rail. So what happened? As usual, the left ate itself, right? The Obama administration needed shovel-ready projects because the money that they were spending, it was a stimulus package. It was supposed to be stimulative. So anything that was a more ambitious transportation project or infrastructure project needed like years of environmental impact work. So where did most of that stimulus money go? It went to filling potholes in New Jersey. I'm being intentionally provocative, but like there's $8 billion of high-speed rail money that just all got dithered away into small bore things. And so what the Biden folks did here on infrastructure, on industrial policy. Like I've driven cross country 6 times. I know the middle of the country very, very well. And we've ravaged the middle of the country. And the fact that a president stood up and said, we're going to build again in this country, we're going to build chips and we're going to build battery plants and we're going to do all of this stuff. It's just extraordinary how much they got done in 4 years. And so, yes, it's all imperfect, right? But democracy is imperfect. I mean, people who believe in democracy have to stop believing in perfection. That is the path to fascism. Like sometimes I want a hat that says "Make a little corruption great again," right? Like the book talks about this. Like if you're going to sit there and say, "Oh well, the Obamacare website," I mean, come on, give me a break. Working in government's really hard. Post Reagan, post neoliberalism, most government runs on bubblegum and shoestring. People have no idea, even on the left, people have no idea how hard people in government work. And it's going to be imperfect. It's going to be imperfect. And that's the nature of consensus driven democracy. It was really refreshing to hear, I think, especially Michelle Obama talk about that the other night at the convention where she said, these guys are human. They're gonna make mistakes. We gotta have their back. And so, yes, all the bills are imperfect, but I think they are directionally enormous and that we will be reaping the benefits of the Biden administration in this country for 25 to 50 years.
Yeah, and it's going to build up capacity of public service, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing is trying to figure out how to get away from a system that doesn't allow the government to figure out how to do things the right way. I mean, we have this discussion all the time. I'm sure you've heard about this a lot, is how expensive it costs to build a subway in the United States.
Oh, that's crazy.
It's a lot of things, but it's also kind of the folks that work for the public agencies being able to get in there and do the work that they need to do, right? And we have a bunch of consultants and stuff like that. But if you farm everything out outside of the agencies, it makes it harder.
Yeah, no, we need to do something about the infrastructure industrial complex.
Yeah.
It is a huge problem. And the other thing is the jurisdiction thing. If you ride Crossrail in London, you understand that Transport for London is one agency that had one jurisdiction over the entire place. You look at what happened with congestion pricing in New York City. We don't have the jurisdictional setup that we need because this entire country was built on this idea of decentralizing power. But I just wanted to catch something else you said, which is when Eisenhower passed the Highway Act in 56, it was also part of a national mood. There was a desire to de-densify. People were worried about nuclear war in the cities. There was also all of this stuff around race that was clearly emergent, the guess who's coming to dinner thing. There is a national mood that is coupled with Biden's infrastructure bill. Young people are the most energized and adamant I've ever seen about this housing issue. They are shut out, they're pissed off. And so I think what's going to make the infrastructure bill successful is the fact that there is now grassroots advocacy that's going to latch on to top down administrative things that have happened from the federal government and locally say, we want these things. The ballot referenda we're seeing for transit, the elimination of single family zoning in all sorts of municipalities. There is a very powerful, I think what a lot of youngins call it today is this abundance movement. It's being driven by a very large demographic. So to me, this thing of what happens at the federal level for it to really work is it's about its synergy with what happens at the local level. And that I sense writ large across both red states and blue states. There is no political divide there. Kamala Harris talked about 3 million new housing units, which is great. It's music to my ears. But my question is where, what, how? Like, we're not going to use government subsidy to again promote sprawl, right? And yet some will argue that that's the cheapest way to build starter homes. But I think a tremendous amount of thought needs to go into not just the quantity, but the quality.
Yeah. Your discussion about the building type that is at that sweet spot, the 50 dwelling units an
The
acre,
Goldilocks.
the
Yeah.
Goldilocks, and also your New York Times article thinking about that too. We recently had some folks on from USC talking about their research and sprawl and kind of how California is different from Texas in the housing markets. And, California, has lots of regulations and all that stuff, and Texas less so. But actually, it's not that that's causing the difference in housing prices. It's the availability of sprawling land. And so Houston's starting to run out of land. Las Vegas starting to run out of land for that sprawl. And so the housing prices are going to get closer to California. And so there's that discussion as well as like you asking, where do we put these housing units? Well, if you have to stop putting them on periphery on these cheap pieces of land with cheap housing construction, you have to start going inward. And so what does that mean for the cost of housing and production? What does that mean for like the codes and stuff, the zoning reforms, all those things that happen with that? So I found that really interesting, the research that they were working on that was like, California and Texas are really not that different when it comes to how this is going to end up. California just happens to be in the future.
The thing is, the things that we call cities outside of the big cities, right, are pockmarked with parking and the detritus of urban renewal. And that Goldilocks scale is the perfect scale for those cities. Inner city Detroit, inner city Houston, because there's a lot of those cities that are composed of single family housing fabric already. Like it's not, right? And so that scale works. But the other thing is, if you just look at the basic economics, it's incredibly hard to make like concrete buildings with elevators and fire stairs work in those environments. Like they just don't pencil, right? And so, like, I think that model is a really good replicable kind of prototype for how to do infill density in a lot of our cities that really want that infill density because young people want to live there, and you can do that relatively inexpensively, and it has this whole carbon negative aspect. I think it can be an important part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Which goes back to this thing about the 3 million new housing units and like what could they be.
Yeah. And I think politically they get out of a lot of trouble by not mentioning that, but they have to address it somehow, right? Because you can't just build more housing on the periphery. It just doesn't make sense from what they're trying to do from an environmental standpoint with climate change action and things like that.
And look, the federal government does that all over the place, right? Like we won this competition design air traffic control towers, this R2D2 thing you mentioned, right? There are all sorts of sustainability criteria and other criteria. I mean, like, it's just not that hard to bake in criteria that says if you want government grants, you need to, do things a certain way. And especially for municipalities to say, hey, you want money to build housing? Great. You got to loosen up some zoning restrictions and you've got to do the following things. And then it becomes the municipality's choice whether they want to do that or not. But that is really SOP for the federal government. Like it's just not such a big deal. And so that's what's really exciting about this moment. We can stop fighting about the what and we can start thinking about the how, right? And like that's interesting because you can engage communities in that question and you can start to imagine a very, very different kind of constitution for what the American dream means. Because for a lot of people now, the American dream is not that lawn and two SUVs in the driveway, but there isn't a substitute vision, right? And so we have this idea about American dream. It's about opportunity. That's great. But there's still a lot of people who have in their heads that it's the suburban house and the two kids in the driveway. This is a moment where we can stop squabbling about what an American family means. Like we know now that an American family means lots of different things, lots of different people. Same idea. then therefore their housing should mean lots of different things for lots of different people. How they get to work should be lots of different things for lots of different people. And so, like, opening that up and having that conversation about the how, that to me is the most exciting part of this moment.
How would you frame that? The previous framing was a car in every driveway and a chicken in the pot of every house, or something like that, right? Something along those lines. Like, how would you frame that for a new generation? Because that's, I mean, whoever comes up with that phrase or framing wins the contest, right?
Well, in the first book, I called it an infrastructure of opportunity. And so I was thrilled when Harris came out with this opportunity economy label, because if you look at the origins of the American dream, it has nothing to do with houses and cars. It was written by a guy named James Trislow Adams, 1931, I think. And it is about equal opportunity for every man and woman in the country, pretty advanced for 1931, right? That was the American dream. And so that's what I'm saying. You can then translate that into like multiple visions for how people live. We don't need a one size fits all. It certainly isn't a nuclear family living in a single family house with two cars in the driveway. And again, Goldilocks is a model for some people. For other people, they'll live in a single family house, hopefully near rail-based transit. Other people will live in apartments in the city. That's fine. But let's give people the range of options. And like again, I think that will start to address the two big issues we've got as a society, political division and climate change, because it starts to create a kind of communal density.
Yeah. There's a section in your book that talks about young architects and their ennui, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
number of references to their paths to ennui. And I'm wondering what you hope for young architects and young people generally, because I feel like that's something that you focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time in and out of academia, and I spent a lot of time speaking to younger people meaning 20s, 30s. And look, architects are always filled with ennui. It's a crazy profession. People feel like they're disrespected. It's amazing. Like if you go to pick out stone in Italy and you understand a place where architects are respected, literally you're treated like a prime minister or something when you land. But in most places, people don't understand us. They don't understand what we do. They confuse us with builders. They just don't get what we do. One of the challenges for this book was to have it read for multiple audiences. So I absolutely wanted it to read for policymakers and policy wonks and people in the world who think about how you construct our built environment, and especially around climate change and social division. At the same time, it is a kind of challenge to my own discipline, because my discipline has argued itself out of its own relevance. Like I talk about the fact that we have continuously been more and more risk averse and gotten ourselves away from things that would, present risk. And so you relegate yourself to the kiddie table and then you complain about the chicken nuggets, right? Like, and this leaves young architecture students really adrift, because I came of age when success in architecture meant building some spaceship in the sand built by slaves, and this architecture thing was born. And that is not at all what undergirds the beginnings of modern architecture. The beginnings of modern architecture was a social movement. And so giving young architects a potential new direction of what they can consider as success is part of what the book tries to lay out. So what I had to weave in there is like why a policymaker would care about such an issue. And they should care about that issue the same reason that they care that law schools are pumping out good ethical attorneys that are thinking about the law in smart and new ways, or doctors or economists or any other major discipline in our world that impacts things like climate, right? And so hopefully young architects will get something out of the book that helps give them some sense of hope and a kind of why about what they do, because most of them are smart enough to go do something that earns them more money and whatever, but it's a passion profession. But passion towards what is the question?
Is it hard? I mean, there's an ethical line that you follow in your work and discuss in the book about not working for dictators, not working on jails, not doing those types of things. But some of the young architects might get pulled into that stuff because they're working for a large firm that decides that for them, or they decide to work, it's hard to find a job, and the job that they find is the one that doesn't have kind of the higher ideals that they might want for themselves.
I think it's really important for young people to have a voice, and they do have a voice today. And, it's getting harder and harder. I know some of those large corporate firms, and some of them are stepping away from designing prisons. Some of them are stepping away from designing in Saudi Arabia. I mean, we got called to work on this absurd NEOM thing, this MBS project, 3 times, and we said no every time. And it is, I'll tell you where it's hard. It's hard because it's very hard to make ends meet. But I think the more young people push on the profession, and there are groups of young people who do this, who organize separate from their jobs in nonprofits and so forth, who push on the profession and say the profession has to have a higher bar for itself, a kind of, the book talks about a Hippocratic oath for our profession, then that's going to lift all boats, right? There's going to be fewer architects in the future because of AI. And like, what do those fewer architecture firms do? I'm hopeful there because back when I was a baby architect, you couldn't say boo to your boss. That's just not the way things are anymore.
Well, there are a number of projects your firm has done, and this is something I ask most folks, and they kind of hem and haw about it. But I'm wondering which one you're most proud of, or which one is most interesting to you.
Um, that is a toughie. In the book, we try to lay out a number of examples, both historical examples and things done by other firms that kind of set the stage for, so it's not just like promoting our work. I
Right.
thought that was very important. But it's hard for me not to say Domino right now. I've been working on the Domino Sugar Refinery and the park around it for 10 years. And it's a point of tremendous pride because not only did I think it came out beautifully, and the owner developer, Two Trees, is amazing, and they did an extraordinary job with it. And, the community was very much a part of how that whole thing came to be. But it exemplifies this thing that we started the conversation with, which is it is a lot of density on that site. There's transit in terms of ferry and biking. I wish there was more transit. There's still hope for a light rail line someday. But the community really pressed, Jeff, for this idea that it shouldn't just be these banal buildings. And that the new architecture, and in our case, what we designed, the sugar refinery, which is a weave of old and new, needed to channel the character of this place. And so, this notion that architecture can help pull history forward into the future is, I think, for many people, again, not everyone, some people are always going to be NIMBY, but for many people, compelling if you can explain to them the stakes. And that's when the technocratic stuff becomes really important. And you say, look, 7 billion going to 10, we all know that. There's basic statistics. People are trying to urbanize. We have a housing crisis. I think most people who are good people will hear all that. But then if you can explain to them that you're going to do it in a way that has quality, that has bearing in terms of their understanding of their own neighborhoods, this notion of a palimpsest, of layering history. So Domino, I feel like, does all that pretty well. And so right now, especially since that's our major built work, architecture takes so long, right? There's other things on the horizon, but like right now, that's the thing I'm the proudest of. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame expansion's coming in Cleveland. There's a building in Princeton that's coming, bridge under construction in Indianapolis. So there's a lot of fun stuff. But that's the one that like makes my heart go aflutter.
That's awesome. I have a Cleveland band for you that plays only transit music if you're interested.
Excellent.
They'll be on the show soon, the Frans.
Cleveland's an amazing rock city.
Well, and also as a Star Wars fan, I must admit I was impressed by the ability to get an R2D2 reference in a discussion about air traffic control towers. That's
Absolutely.
That's also
Absolutely.
great too.
Like thumbs up for the stout. Enough with skinny models. R2D2. Right?
It's never really easy writing a book, as we know from the folks who have written books and been on the show. And it's a lot of work, it's a lot of stress, but also a lot of fun too. I'm wondering, was there something that was easy about it?
Well, for me, writing is my great therapy. I mean, I just wrote a piece in Vital City. Things come to me and I have to write them down. And both the design of buildings and the writing of anything, like editing is something that's an incredible art form in both designing something and writing something. My daughter was asking me like if I'd ever retire, and I'm like, no. And then she sort of pushed me and said, well, but what would you do, Dad? Like if you didn't have to work anymore. And I said, I think I'd sit around all day and think about the difference between synonyms. Like it's kind of crazy that like there are all these words that kind of mean the same thing, but they have like these sort of little shady distinctions. I don't mean shady in a bad way. I mean shades of distinction between them. And like, I love that. I love that about language. It's very similar to architecture about like one kind of brick versus another kind of brick and why. And so, writing a book is incredibly challenging. I had a really great publisher this time, especially last time was great too, but this is Princeton University Press. It's an academic press, it's a whole other level. But you would think that the writing was the hard part. And this is a 7-year project, and writing, there was a lot of rewrites. A pandemic happened, an insurrection happened. There's a lot of stuff that happened. But also when you go through academic review and then you just can't wait to get to the fun stuff of figuring out graphic design. And Pentagram was an incredible graphic designer. But look, the other thing is it's absolutely terrifying because it's there for posterity. Like this essay I just published in Vital City, I wrote my publisher and I said, "Oh, it's missing a comma here." It's already out, and he just changed it, and it's fine. You can't do that with a book, right? Like a book is out there for posterity. That is absolutely terrifying. But just like I believe in the analog virtues of architecture or film or vinyl, books are right in there, right? Like, and that's not to be a Luddite. It is just, I think the digital world has made us even more fond of the physical things that give us joy. And for me, books are absolutely that. And like the more I know about how they're made and the paper and the whole thing, it's fantastic.
I want to say I'm holding the book right now, and the coolest thing to me, and I read a lot of books, but the coolest thing to me is this huge fold out with
the gatefold,
with all of the city plans and street network grids and all that stuff. I love that. It's just like reminding me of planning
My
school.
publisher just rocks. Because we realized that like this was going to be really hard to do on a 2-page spread. And I had, by the way, I should say, this amazing in-house research team in my office who spent just untold hours doing the drawings and the research, and they're all name by name in the back of the book, but that gatefold, I am hoping that in fact that entire chapter is something that people use in schools. Like people should understand the history of these things. And we went through this really ugly period in the 1980s where history became historicism and it became turned into really bad architecture. And so that got rejected by the academy. And then the next thing you know, no one was teaching history anymore. And postmodernism sort of meant you didn't need to know history anymore, right? And everyone's truth was everyone's individual truth. No, I'm sorry, there's history. And so hopefully the book will help ground people back into that.
I think you should make it into a poster, honestly. People should buy the book and get it, but you should make it into a poster.
What a really good idea.
When I was a kid, when I was in high school, I liked Star Wars and I liked certain movies, and I was a runner too. I ran track and cross country. And so I would go into the magazines and I'd cut out all the clips and stuff, and then I'd put them on my wall. And this feels like, as my older planner self, this feels like something I'd want on my wall. So, poster.
Wow. You're going to get royalties for that one.
Well, I don't need them, but I would love a poster if you make one.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, the book is The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature, Culture, and Joy. Where can folks find a copy?
You can pre-order it on Amazon right now. It'll be out the end of September, and it should be in local bookstores and small, design bookshops and other kinds of bookshops like that. We've targeted a lot of small bookstores for its distribution. So again, it's Princeton University Press. It has this nice silver cover.
Yeah, it's
perfect
beautiful
for Christmas.
Beautiful book, yeah.
right. And so it should be pretty easy to get.
Awesome. And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
The easiest way to email me is info@pow.studio website, or I'm on social media at Vishaan NYC on the thing that Elon Musk destroyed, or LinkedIn.
Well, Vishaan, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks. Really a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.